Hello and welcome to episode 147 of Page One, the Writers Podcast. I'm Tarek.
I'm Marco, and thanks for joining us on the Writers Podcast, where we like to speak to writers of all kinds about their writing careers, find out how they got into the industry and try and get as many hints and tips from them as possible. And obviously, we've got a huge number of great past guests there from the world of books, from screenwriters, comic writers, video game writers, journalists, comedians. So please do check out the back catalogue if you haven't done that before. But this week we are in the world of, we're sort of in two worlds, historical crime and modern day crime.
Yeah, we're chatting with Elle Connel. And Elle is both, as Marco says, both a modern crime writer, but she also writes historical fiction under her real name, Lucy Ribchester. And she kind of bounces between historical crime fiction and modern crime books, and she's had a lot of success. Her modern day crime books was a Val McDermid New Blood pick. It was a Waterson's Edinburgh Book of the Year. And it's interesting chatting to someone who uses two different names, jumps between two different genres, and builds two different audiences up.
Yeah, I mean, we've spoken to a few people that have pseudonyms, and for that reason, because they're writing in different genres, which can be. I can see the sense in it, but obviously it's almost like you're starting again in some ways when you write that first book under the pseudonym. But we also chat about, sometimes when people write more modern crime fiction, if women are told to use your initials because men won't buy books, especially thriller books by women, which is nonsense. And we chat to Lucy about that, and she explains why she very much didn't want to do that and wanted to make it clear that the book was written by a woman. And we also chat about her historical crime fiction as well. Her first book, she pitched it as Angela Carter meets Dan Brown, which very much makes me want to read it now.
Yeah, and her latest book is You Can Stay, which came out in April last year, and it's a kind of modern day SAS soldier
Royal Marine, I think it is.
Royal Marine soldier.
About their training.
Yeah. And one aspect of they get handed a chicken and they get close to the chicken and then they have to kill the chicken. They're told to kill the chicken at the end.
Yeah, that's right. Very bizarre.
Brutal training.
Yeah, very brutal. But yeah, we chat to her all about that. So it's a really interesting episode. So we'll get straight into it after a quick advert for our writer's notebook, and then we'll be back at the end of the podcast with a bit more chat and to let you know about next week's guest.
But for now, on with the podcast.
The blank page. To some, it's terrifying, an obstacle to overcome. But we prefer to think of it as an opportunity, a blank canvas to be filled with all of the adventures and characters in our head. So how to overcome that fear? Well, we all know the best advice for a writer is write. Seriously, get words on the page and more will follow.
But what about later, when you start trying to pull those threads of what you've written together? What about the character you wrote about way back at the start? Who was she again? What was she carrying? And where did she leave the MacGuffin that she now really needs in the third act? Think about all those top thrillers you like to read, or that amazing drama you just watched. What do they all have in common? Structure and planning.
As aspiring writers ourselves, we've tried many different methods to try and organise all the thoughts about the stories we want to tell. We've been there searching for a piece of scrap paper to note something down, or making a quick note on our phone in between meetings.
Or sometimes we'll make a note in whatever notebook we're carrying, or a document on our laptop so we don't forget that great idea. Let's be honest, it can all be a bit messy and it's easy to lose track of everything. And that's when we realised it's not just the story that needs structure and planning, but the way we gather all of our thoughts about it as well.
And so we made Page One. Page One is more than just another notebook. It's a place to put down all your ideas for your latest project, divided into easy-to-use sections that will help you plan your story, so that when that blank page comes calling, you're ready to answer. And then afterwards, once it's written, we realised you need to plan how to let people read it, so we included a section relating to submissions.
Each one is designed for one project, whether you want to write a book, screenplay, a comic, or any other kind of story. We truly believe that when you use it, it will help you get to the main event, writing your story. So we hope this helps.
We can't wait to read what you come up with.
And remember, every story starts with page one.
Did you always want to be a writer?
Yes, I did. Yeah, in a nutshell, basically. Yeah, although I don't think I ever thought that I would be a writer. Probably a lot of writers feel that way. Um,
Yep.
yeah, you're still sort of gobsmacked when you get your first book published. But yeah, basically, I think I do remember coming home from primary school, either primary one or two, and we'd been asked to write a poem, and just thinking that this was the best thing I'd ever done in school. Being able to, instead of just reading or listening to work, being asked to kind of create your own. And a lot of what I used to write, a lot of what I still write, to be honest, I still think of it as pastiche fan fiction for the books that I love. Throughout childhood, then whenever I really got into an author, whether that was Enid Blyton's, not the famous five, what are they called? The mysteries, the one where they solve. No, it wasn't the Secret Seven. It was the one where they solve all those really kind of twee, cozy crimes. um, the Five Find Outers. That's it. Things
Okay.
like
Never
the
heard of those ones.
disappearing pantomime cat, and it's classic Blyton. It's yeah, very questionable. Not the kind of thing I would want to revisit in a hurry.
Yeah.
Now for all kinds of
It's
reasons,
nice to live
gender
on in the
politics,
memory of what it
race.
was like as a child and leave it
Yeah.
there.
But yeah, I would write my own kind of, I suppose, fan fiction responses to that. And then later on, when I was a little bit older, got really into Christopher Pike and started to write kind of pastiches on that. Just going through the whole gamut, right through to, I remember discovering Linda LaPlante's novels, and that was really my first foray into crime fiction. And there was something about peeling open the covers and finding the kind of dark side of the world lying within those pages that was just really, really fascinating, and started me off, I think, on a bit of a trajectory towards writing slightly darker stuff that's gone up and down with my writing career, but it's certainly coming out, I think it's fair to say, in the Elle Connel books.
And obviously, you always enjoyed writing and things like that, and I think you studied English at uni and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But how did you make that sort of transition into actually, I'm going to send this book or whatever it is out to someone? How did that happen?
So it took a really long time. And when I was at university, and even for a few years afterwards, I went down to London to do a master's in, it was in Shakespeare studies, but it was really, it was theatre that I was really, really interested in and passionate about throughout basically my kind of late teenage years, right through university, right through the few years following university. I had this absolute conviction that I wanted to become a playwright. A lot of what I read in my later teenage years was plays. It just got completely into and fascinated by the idea of like bringing dialogue to life and subtext and all of that kind of stuff. So once I finished my master's, then I enrolled on the Royal Court's Young Writers Programme. Had a really fantastic time and learned a lot in that very intensive 10-week course, and produced the Hourglass Factory. Produced a script of the Hourglass Factory for my kind of end of course project.
Okay.
And I kind of tried to get that off the ground, not very hard, with groups of friends I knew that were actors. And I think it was around about that time that I kind of discovered that while I might have the inclination towards playwriting from a kind of writing perspective, there was all the other stuff that went along with that, like like the practicalities, I suppose, of just getting a play off the ground without the backing of like a major theatre. You have to organize actors for a read through, and so it seemed to me that at the time of life that I was at, where I was working full time, it was just much more natural for me to kind of go back into rediscovering prose and a love of prose fiction. And I think that was when I kind of returned to the idea of crime fiction. The crime fiction has always been the books that I turned to, or had always been the books I turned to in my downtime. So, when I wasn't studying literature at university, in the holidays, I would read crime fiction. I would read Agatha Christie's. And I think it was just kind of that realization of actually, everybody says you should write what you love, write what you're passionate about. And that kind of clicked, well, actually, I'm really into this. This is the books I choose to read, maybe I should be trying to write this instead of trying to write something that that I read because it's aspirational or anything like that. So I rewrote The Hourglass Factory as a kind of crime thriller. and all of the other influences that were already there, like my kind of interest in feminism, in the kind of fantastical, larger than life characters. By that point I was reviewing dance. I'd started to review dance and cabaret and burlesque, and it was really the kind of the late, what do you call the 2000s? No, the late noughties.
Late. No, yeah, noughties.
I
Late
think
noughties.
so. Yeah.
Late
It sounds
noughties.
weird,
That,
I know.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
late tens sounds weirder, I think. So.
It does, doesn't it? There was like that massive kind of burlesque revival around that time, and so that all seeped into the Hourglass Factory. But it took me from starting to write that as a crime novel to signing the book deal with Simon and Schuster. It took about 6 years. So it was a really slow progress. It was really slow progress. And within that time, I got an agent. I won a Scottish Book Trust New Writers Award. That was the best thing. I will rhapsodize about the Scottish Book Trust until the cows come home, because it was honestly, they continue to be such an incredible force for good and strong kind of backbone to like my whole career. And they're just it's such a brilliant organization, and they do such brilliant things to support writers. But that was really the kind of turning point from it becoming something where I was kind of had a bit of a pipe dream to something where I felt like people were actually behind me.
Yeah.
What does winning that? Because I've heard of that award and stuff, but what does winning that actually mean? I think, do they give you mentorship and things like that?
Exactly, yeah. So it can mean it can be tailored to kind of what's helpful to you as a writer. They do give you a financial package, which at that time I'd just gotten freelance as a writer, as a writer, copywriter, journalist, tutor, all the different offshoots of writing. And so that gave me a couple of months to sort of solidly focus on writing fiction, without any guilt of thinking, well, I'm taking time and money away from more sensible income streams. There's also the mentoring package. So I worked with Linda Cracknell, the short story writer. I specifically, because I had an agent at that point for my novel, for the Hourglass Factory, then I specifically wanted to work on craft, particularly short story craft. And so Linda was just absolutely invaluable in putting me through my paces and really trying to like hone my writing on the line level, structure level. They also provide training in publicity, helping you, for example, get your website off the ground, get your presence on Twitter, and performance technique as well. We did a workshop with how would I describe her? A performance specialist, but training in how to read your work aloud and all that kind of stuff. It was just, but they were also, more than anything else, they were just a sounding board. If you had a question, because as you'll know yourself, like the industry can be quite difficult to navigate, I think, and you don't kind of know who to trust always. You don't necessarily know what to believe when you're being told. There's so many different paths to being a writer, and the Scottish Book Trust were just there to kind of say, no, you should be taking yourself seriously. You should be getting paid for this. You shouldn't be letting anybody do this to you or make you feel like this is just a hobby or, anything like that. They were just a really solid, it's like having a really kind of solid fairy godmother in your corner.
And you mentioned that during that phase you found your agent, and how did you go about doing that? Did you go down the kind of classical route of sending out applications with synopsis and chapters, etc.?
I did, yeah. I sent out a whole bunch of them, and I also just asked anybody that I knew that was even remotely connected to the book industry who their agents were, or who if they knew anyone that was an agent. And eventually, I actually got my agent through a contact of a contact of a contact. Right. It was someone who I said, do you know anyone who's a literary agent? No, but I know somebody who might. Okay, no, but I know somebody else who might. And eventually, so in that respect, then my agent's Daisy Parente is a Lichens and Rubinstein, and I just feel like really, really lucky to have found her. It was a long process, but I think she was really starting out her career as an agent round about the time when my manuscript landed on her desk. And I had another agent who had gone down the more traditional route of just submission, sending out, who I was working with the manuscript on at the time. And she was a very big name, and I wasn't quite comfortable with the direction that she was pushing me in. Although she was a big name, I felt kind of like I wasn't really on board. It would be like, I would be making changes to my manuscript in order to try and produce something for the market rather than what I set out to do. And when I had my initial kind of email exchange or phone call, I can't remember what it was, with Daisy, and she just name checked several books that I loved and that I really wanted to write in that vein of, and I just felt like she understood what I wanted to do. And that's gone throughout, because I've written vastly different books at various phases of my career, and my agent has been so amenable to that. It's been incredible. She's never tried to push me into doing anything that I didn't want to do, and that's been the most valuable thing, the most valuable part of the relationship, I think.
It's quite a bold but important move, isn't it? I think, and especially for a new author who's just found an agent. And often you kind of think, well, that's it. I found them. I don't want to risk losing
hold on.
Yeah, but hold on tight and just do what they tell me, because they know best. And I think having that kind of the guts to say, actually, this is not going the way I want it to go, and that interplay between commercialism and art and stuff, and trying to navigate where you want to land on that scale, and saying this isn't for me, is quite hard. So that's quite impressive.
Thanks. I've done this a few times where, it's that thing of like, am I making the right decision, or am I being a complete and utter idiot? And I think sometimes it's a bit of both, like there's a short route to success, but is it necessarily, you do have to think, like, is this necessarily what I want to be doing? Because, if you get off, I think when I found this, I've sort of slightly changed tack with my historical fiction writing. And I find that if you get off on the wrong foot, I think it is very, very difficult to get out of that. Or it's very difficult, I think, to change the way a publisher is branding you. Mm-hmm. That is very, very challenging. And so I think you really, really, really need to be happy with the direction that you're going on in, because hopefully, if it's a success, then you'll be writing for the next however many years.
I also think as well that it is such an important thing to do. I totally get the new writer fear of, like, I must do what they're telling me, they're the experts, and it's been so hard to find someone, I'm going to do what they say. But it's not like writing a book is an easy task and a quick task that you can just fire off. So if you project a few years into the future and think, well, do I want to be writing these sorts of books that I'm being pushed into? It is worth reflecting on, I think, in that situation, definitely. And you touched on there that obviously you started off in sort of historical crime fiction under the name, under your real name, Lucy Ribchester. How did you sell that first book? How did that come about?
How did we say? I think I pitched it to Daisy as Angela Carter meets Dan Brown.
Nice.
Which are genuinely two of my favorite authors. I wrote the book that I wanted to read, and that was kind of the Hourglass Factory. Still stand by that. That was the book that I really, really, really wanted to read, and I really want to revisit those characters and do a series at some point. Everybody I meet, every other author is like, have you thought about doing a series? Because publishers love series. And I'm like, every time I mention this to my agent or anybody in the book industry, they're like, no series. The series are gone. And but yeah,
that's interesting.
Yeah, I know. You just hear, but again, it's one of these things. You just hear conflicting things, don't you? That was kind of how I sold that book, and then it sort of slightly shape shifted in the editorial process. But I think, in the end, then I think Simon & Schuster just got, the cover just bang on. I don't know if you've seen that wonderful yellow cover that they
it's really cool.
hand designed, and it's just stunning. I've got a poster of it up in my kid's bedroom, and I will forever treasure it. It just couldn't have been better. The way it was kind of brought out into the world in the end.
And we've chatted to publishers before, and you mentioned it yourself, how it's when you're marketed in a certain way, it's hard to break out of that. And historical and crime are two genres that you don't see a lot of books mashed together in that style. And I wondered if it was difficult getting it picked up. Did you have to focus on one angle more than the other, or did they market it with one focus?
That's a really interesting question, actually. Yes. I didn't, because I was reading a lot of historical crime. I really like C.J. Sansom, who writes the Shardlike Mysteries, and I also really love, I think he's only written 2 books to date, but Jed is it Rubenfeld, Jed Rubenfeld,
Yeah.
who wrote The Interpretation of Murder and
Yeah,
then
yeah,
The
yeah.
Death Instinct. I
That's a
love
great
those
book.
books. I
Yeah.
thought The Interpretation of Murder was just absolutely fantastic. And so that was one of the books that my agent mentioned when she first read Hourglass Factory and said, "Oh, I think it's, I think there's Interpretation of Murder meets possibly a bit of Night Circus." And so that in that respect, it wasn't difficult. However, I do remember having a conversation with someone at SNS way, way, way further down the line once Amber Shadows had been published, and Hourglass Factory had been picked up by a lot of crime festivals and crime publications, and really, really the crime. I was going to say the crime community. I should say the crime writing community is one of the most friendly and welcoming communities, I think, in the book world. It really, really is. And I just felt so at home anytime I was in a room with other crime writers, in the year that Hourglass Factory came out. But in saying that, I had this conversation a couple of years later with somebody at SNS who was kind of baffled by the idea that I thought my books were crime books because they really saw them as historical novels first and foremost, and I never did. I always saw them as crime first and foremost. I've always been interested in the historical setting, and I've never wanted to kind of project a story that wouldn't have come naturally from the era. But I've always, like I said, I've always had this affinity for pastiche, and I think with any crime novel that I approach, that I'm writing in a historical context, I'm really, really influenced by the crime fiction of that era. So, for example, with Hourglass Factory, I've forgotten the name now. I forgot there was two authors. Oh, who was it that wrote The Man Who Was Thursday? G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton, and also there was another Edgar. I've forgotten his name. Hourglass Factory. I'm going like, wait, this is way, way, way pre-kids. I'm thinking back to pre-kids eating my brain. But yeah, the sort of lurid, fantastical, kind of almost spy fiction-y, over-the-top, steampunk-esque kind of books that were part of the Edwardian era very much influenced Hourglass Factory's kind of plot and pacing. And in The Amber Shadows, I was very much influenced by not just the kind of golden age noir-y crime fiction of the period, but predominantly my love of Hitchcock films. So in that respect, it's always kind of the crime and historical angles have always married together very, very closely for me. But I can see that, I can see why some people might view them as one or the other, or as historical novels.
It's a weird thing though, because what is a historical novel?
Yeah.
Historical novel is always something else told in that time period.
Totally.
It'll be a different
you're right.
type of novel, but there'll always be another element to it. So I suppose it is all about sort of how they choose to market it or whatever. But
exactly,
and one thing that we've spoken about with people who have written historical novels is that sort of pull and push between accuracy and authenticity, and how accurate you want to be about specific dates or things, or things like that, as opposed to just getting the feel of the time period and stuff correct. Where do you fall on that scale?
So I think as an author, your responsibility is to the story that you're telling. And I think in that respect, then personally, if that means moving around a historical date, it's not that I would set out to mess around with history, but when I set out to write a book, it's because I'm inspired or drawn to a particular period in history, and that comes from a sort of feeling rather than necessarily wanting a kind of rigorous historical replica. I suppose it's the difference between like building a scale model of St. Paul's Cathedral, say, and like wanting to do a kind of clay impression of it, or the difference between a draftsman's sketch and a impressionist painting. And I definitely would fall more on the kind of impressionist painting side, that I want to capture a kind of an essence of an era, but also that captures an essence of how I see the world or how I interpret the world, and how those two things kind of merge together. So that's not to say that I'm not a stickler for detail. I do like to research thoroughly. It's just that I don't like my research to get in the way of what I'm writing. And in that respect, then I'm learning more and more, the more historical fiction I write, and the more fiction in general I write, that what I don't want to do is stop halfway through a scene and think, oh God, I don't know that, so I'm going to go digging back through my notes until I find the answer. And if I can't find the answer, I'm going to spend a day at the library finding the answer. I would rather, and then by that point, you've interrupted the flow of what it is you're writing. I would rather just flow on, making things up that kind of feel appropriate to me as well, or changing slight details. For You Can Stay, then it's obviously it's got a contemporary setting. But it very much focuses on the selection process for special forces in the military. And I did a few Zoom interviews with former soldiers, read autobiographies of former special forces soldiers, and had, what I felt was a sort of fairly solid grasp of what I wanted to know about that selection process. But there were still elements in it. So, for example, there's quite a disturbing scene earlier on when a lamb is slaughtered as part of the survival outdoors training, and that came from a soldier who told me about having to keep a chicken on his person, sort of look after it inside his coat, kind of snuggle with it, all for 24 hours. They had to give it a name, all of these kind of things to sort of help create a bond between a person and animal, and then at the end of that period had to kill it. I found that quite sort of disturbing and quite irrelevant to the themes that I wanted to explore, particularly those of like humanity and killing. But to me, the chicken, I wanted to go a little bit further with that, so I made it a lamb instead of a chicken. Because to me, a lamb, being, I suppose, a mammal, it had more associations of kind of cutesiness, and there was something more disturbing. So, and because it's a horror novel, you want to sort of take facts and then push their truths further to as far as you can push those truths, I think. And so in that respect, then I did take creative license, but it was kind of it wasn't cavalier. It was very much a decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it, isn't it? You want to do the research so that you know the area that you're writing in, but then, as you say, you want to tell the story, a good story, and you're doing that on the basis of having a good grounding in that area. And so I think if you're too loyal to the research, it can really pull down a story sometimes.
Yeah,
I agree.
Well, you mentioned there that you made the jump to modern day. With your first book was Down by the Water. Yeah. That was your first jump to modern day times. And I wondered, why did you decide to do that?
So the big, I suppose the big life change that happened there was I had twins. And that may not sound connected to making the transition to write really dark psychological thrillers. But it did actually, it's quite a sort of profoundly disturbing and discombobulating time, becoming a parent, and particularly the sort of baptism of fire that is looking after two small babies at once. There was that. There was a lot of sort of stuff that I wanted to unpick, and that there's a lot of that comes out in Down by the Water. But there was also more pragmatic reasons. So I mean, I've always wanted to write. I had always wanted to write contemporary thrillers, and I knew at some point that I might do that, and I didn't know when that would be. And I had actually written another historical novel that I kind of finished the first draft of the day before I went into hospital.
Wow.
And so I was working on edits of that throughout the first year of looking after baby twins, and it was a bit of a mess, that book. It went out on submission. We couldn't find a publisher for it. I'm not really surprised, and I'm actually very glad that we didn't find a publisher, because I think if I had found someone that had sort of picked it up, taken a chance on it, I don't think it would be a book that I was particularly proud of to have out. Okay. So at that point, then I kind of sort of changed tack. I knew I had to start writing again. I knew I wanted to start writing fiction again. And I needed to do something that didn't require a whole lot of spending days in the library, which I just didn't have. So I chatted with my agent, and she was really, this was one of the the moments where I thought she'd think she was at her finest as an agent was just very flexible and said, let's see what we can do, and put some feelers out. And there was an editor who was looking for a thriller writer, and we sort of discussed an idea, and I was I really found a way in which I could explore the things that I wanted to explore. You know, Down by the Water does deal with postnatal depression. It deals with kind of growing older and settling scores from the past. It deals with female friendships. There was a lot of things, and also it deals with historical Scottish monuments. I'd been working for the National Trust for Scotland as a day job in the past, and so there was just a lot of kind of stuff that coalesced in my mind that came together in that thriller, and it just seemed to be the right time to write it. And then Elle Connel was a bit of a sort of Down by the Water was, I suppose, testing the water a little bit with Elle Connel, and once it was out, I just had the bug, and You Can Stay is the fastest book I've ever written. It was written in about less than 3 months during the second lockdown. I just got my head down and I just couldn't let go of the idea. It actually came to me while I was researching the final set of edits for Down by the Water. It came up, the impetus, the stimulus for the premise came up in that research, and I just kind of couldn't let it go.
And you mentioned there that obviously you write these more modern day books under a pseudonym, Elle Connel. What was the thinking behind that? Was it to try and separate, find a new audience because you'd written the historical stuff, so they wouldn't necessarily follow you to crime and things like that?
Yeah, it wasn't so much about finding a new audience. It was kind of about separating them in my own mind, the threads of them. I wanted the total freedom to not sort of think, well, I didn't want somebody to pick up a book with my name on it and feel betrayed because it was so different to Hourglass Factory and Amber Shadows, or to kind of feel pressured into writing in that under that name. Also, I feel like having a pseudonym as well, it kind of gives you the freedom as well to like go to places that you wouldn't necessarily under your own name. Yeah. I know there's this whole thing like other writers that I've known who have said they've been so excited to go into bookshops and see books with their name on it. And this sounds really horrible and really ungrateful, but it kind of makes me feel a bit nauseous. It's very exposing, and that was something that I really struggled with. I was so happy to have a book deal and to have Hourglass Factory out in the world, and then to be commissioned to write Amber Shadows and to do all the research on that. And I absolutely love writing. I'm one of these like ridiculous writers who actually enjoys writing, because most writers you talk to, they're like, oh, I hate it. But yeah, I actually really love the hunkering down and just getting on with the work kind of process, and getting the book out there. I find can feel really, I was surprised at how vulnerable I felt and how sort of exposed. And so writing stuff that was darker and in some ways, and Down by the Water certainly a lot more personal, than having the kind of it felt like a little bit of a cloak of that pseudonym just helped a little bit with the writing of it. But also, there was just separating it in terms of like modern and historical, more sort of prosaic reasons.
And I kind of wanted the practical side of a pseudonym. How do you come up with a name, and how much of a person do you create? Do you create a whole bio of this fake person, and you kind of run their Twitter handle, separately and stuff? And how does that all work?
I kind of wish that I did, actually. So I'm a really big fan of drag, and I've always wanted to be a drag queen or a burlesque artist. And so the idea of like having a persona has always been incredibly exciting to me. I remember having this like fantasy in the early days of starting to write, where I thought, I'll dress up in ridiculous clothes and like have a martini at 11 a.m. and like write these fantastical novels.
Lucy would never drink this, but Elle.
Exactly, yeah. Elle. So it's not quite as glamorous as that, but I do wear red lipstick when I'm writing as Elle Connel. I don't know why. It's just a sort of differentiating habit that I've picked up. It was sort of started as a sort of silly way to amuse myself when I went to cafes or the library to write as Elle Connel, but now it's kind of stuck. But yeah, how did I pick the name? Elle is my initial, Elle, but I didn't want to be an initial because it's kind of hard for me to talk about this without implying that I'm slagging off writers who have done that, and I absolutely don't want to do that, because I think everyone's got their own reasons for their pseudonym, their persona, the names they publish under. But there is a massive tradition in publishing of encouraging women to hide their gender on the grounds that like men don't buy books written by women, and I just really wanted to take a stand against that and say that I'm not interested in male readers that are not interested. They're not going to like my books anyway, and I don't want them to read my books, and I don't care. So I really wanted my name to be a woman's name, and also, I mean, Elle is she in French, so it kind of worked that way. Connell is my nana's maiden name, and it is the sort of Scottish wing of the family. So I just really wanted to use that. My nana also, she passed away 10 or 15 years ago, but she was the writer in the family, and she never published any novels, but she wrote a column for her local newspaper. She wrote a beautiful memoir about my caring for my granddad who had dementia, and I just really wanted to kind of honor as well that name, because I feel I sort of feel a connection to her. Like that's maybe where I got the writing bug from.
Yeah, no, that's a nice connection there.
Yeah,
and when you write as Elle Connel, you've said the lipstick changes, but did it take you time to find a different voice in your own writing, or did it just come naturally when you changed the setting and told a different kind of story?
So I'd been writing short stories for a while, and they've always been quite different, both to my novels and also to each other. So I always found that short stories was a kind of place where I could experiment with different voices and different types of writing, not necessarily kind of hugely experimental, but just very subtle differences, in characterization and maybe creating something that's more realistic when I've been used to writing stuff that's a little bit more over the top or fantastical. So in that sense, I didn't consciously try to alter the voice at all. And I think it probably did develop during the first draft of Down by the Water. Somebody asked this question recently, actually, in an event about creating characters and whether as an author you plot or you plan your characters first, or whether you kind of just dive in. And I definitely err on the side of just diving in, because I think just knowing what you know now about the publishing process and the writing process itself, you're going to revise so many times. So even when I write a first draft, it's like it's not even draft one, it's draft zero. And so in that sense, then finding the voice probably did take a good few chapters, but by that point, you're kind of into it. That's almost like your warm up and act, and then you're going to go back and revise that once you're comfortable in that voice. So I think it did change a little bit. I think there's a detachment, certainly, to which is kind of, maybe that's the wrong word, I don't know, detachment, but there's a simplicity, I think, to the Elle Connel books. Maybe I'm not quite concentrating, so I'm not quite so indulging my kind of sense of like wanting to have fun and describe everything and indulge in all these like sensory details of a historical world. Like there's a simplicity to the storytelling that I'm sort of quite committed to. Just I want to make it I want to make the Elle Connel books really readable and really focus on just trying to tell the story and scare the reader.
And what's your process when you come to write? Do you have like a time of day? Do you kind of try and write for a few hours, or do you try and write for the whole day? What's your routine?
So it's really changed just because obviously like with pandemic and having kids, like domestic circumstances are just kind of constantly changing. At the moment, for writing you can stay, then that was written in second lockdown, and so I would arrange times with my partner where I could go off and write in the bedroom, and it was written over winter, so I would just tuck myself up in bed a lot of the time with lots of tea and coffee and chocolate, and just kind of get that done. And those were the moments in which the kids were not allowed in the bedroom because I was working and that was my space. I also wrote a little bit of it in cafes, so if we took the kids to the museum, then maybe we'd do a bit of tag teaming it. He'd take the kids around the museum and I'd write for an hour in the cafe, and then we'd swap over. So that was that. At the moment, then my kids are in nursery 3 days a week, so I tend to try and get as much work done on those 3 days as possible, whether that's writing a little bit at home and then when I kind of feel myself flagging, I'll maybe head to the library and work there for an hour. I tend to find that I've got quite a long, I can have quite a long attention span for writing, but it has to be in bursts and it has to involve a change of scene. So I can do an hour in a cafe and then take a break and then do an hour at home, but I couldn't do 2 hours in one stretch kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you said there earlier that you know, in sort of finding your voice as Elle Connel, you wrote those first few chapters knowing that they would be revised. Are you someone that does that pushes through to the end of that first draft and then revises? You don't revise as you go then?
I want to say yes. I think largely speaking, yes. However, I am trying to learn more and more when something's not working out, that it's easier sometimes to unpick less than it is to like fly on through it and then you've got the whole thing to unpick. I kind of don't like stopping things midway through. With Down by the Water, then I think I did plow through. I did just keep plowing through because I knew roughly, if I know the story that I'm telling is still on a kind of forward drive, then I will just push through. And then there's all the things that you can sort out in a second draft, like characterization, tweaks to character, whether that's sort of through description or dialogue, tweaks to setting. But if you know that the story is kind of veered off a tangent, or you know that there's a kind of fundamental fault, like there's a character that you really need to have introduced from the beginning, and you've just plonked them in the middle of the book, that is probably when I would take a break and start to revise before progressing with the story. I think at the moment I've just given up on I've just abandoned an Elle Connel book that I wrote 60,000 words of.
Oh,
and
wow.
It's a brutal decision. It really was a brutal decision, but it was just I just knew that it wasn't working the way I wanted it to. It was growing arms and legs, and the Elle Connel books are absolutely not, in my mind, I don't want them to grow arms and legs. I want them to be very clean, very streamlined stories that take a particular interest of mine and kind of push it through to its most horrific conclusion or endpoint. But yeah, I don't want them to be kind of, to have sort of epic side plots and you know, saga style backstories.
I see. I think that's quite a difficult thing to make, isn't it? You know, that's, you know, when you know something's not working, when to chuck something. And there's always stuff you can use, I suppose, and you know, you don't throw it away for good, for, you know. But yeah, when you get that far in, that's quite a brave move, I think.
And brave or stupid, I don't know.
Well, you mentioned that your latest book was You Can Stay, which came out in April 2022. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what that book's about?
Sure. So You Can Stay is a psychological thriller. It is largely inspired by my absolute love and worship of Stephen King's novel Misery. Yeah. But the stimulus for it came about when I was, like I said, when I was researching Down by the Water. I wanted to create a character in Down by the Water who had an army background, and so I decided I was going to read some of the SAS Who Dares Wins ex-Special Forces soldiers' autobiographies. And the first one I picked up was Ollie Ollerton's. It's called Breakpoint. It's really, really fantastic book, and in it, he describes an anecdote of when he was doing the escape and evade training, where you have to escape on the hills on the run from a hunter force. And he describes how some of the soldiers would knock on farmhouse doors and ask if they could just kind of sneak into somebody's barn or take shelter in their house. Sometimes you get given a fry-up if you're lucky. It's strictly against the rules, but they all do it anyway. And this just sort of struck me. I think I'd actually just watched a rerun of Misery on Netflix maybe a few nights before, and it just struck me in my mind. I thought, God, what if you knock on the wrong farmhouse door? I mean, that would be a disaster. And in the way, I don't know, in the way the sort of warped mind of anyone who writes kind of dark crime or horror or psychological fiction, that idea just kind of like unspooled and ran. So it's a book about Connor, who is a 26-year-old serving Royal Marine. He's not in the best stage of his life. He's kind of a little bit tired in his career, and his partner has just left him, with it, taking with her their young daughter, and he thinks that by trying out for special forces, he can prove to her that he's a sort of serious man. He's going somewhere with his career. He thinks that in doing so, he'll kind of win her back, and that they'll create this perfect family unit and all live together happily ever after. The training is obviously really hard and really grueling. And then when he's in the middle of this escape and evade exercise, several of his colleagues are taken, but he manages to escape and beds down in a bothy, where he is discovered by a local farm owner called Elle, who invites him in and says that he can stay in her cottage and she'll feed him. And he makes the wrong decision. Elle turns out to be not quite what she seems, not quite as wholesome as she seems. Not quite the Annie. Well, yeah, perhaps the Annie Wilkes of Bodmin Moor, but with slightly different interests and MOs to Annie Wilkes. So yeah, I think anything more than that would be a bit of a spoiler.
That sounds great, but yeah, and I can almost see when you describe that story how as a writer you could take that idea and just write it as quickly as you did there, because it's one of these ideas that you go, that's great, I just want to focus on this entirely. And it's the idea that you will continue to write Elle Connel books, or will there be more Lucy Ribchester books as well? Are you going to keep both names going in the future?
Yeah, that's the plan. So the latest book that I've written, because when things began to open up again, I did find that I had some time on my hands to get back into library research. So I've picked up on a book that I started writing a long time ago. It's set in 18th century Edinburgh, and it's all about the Edinburgh Musical Society and the kind of migratory nature, I suppose, of Edinburgh's kind of cultural and social scene during the Enlightenment. It's called Murder Ballad, and it is out on submission right now. So
nice.
I'm bricking it.
Very exciting.
And really hoping that it will find its way out into the world and will find a publisher. But that's a Lucy Ribchester novel. That's a historical novel. It's not quite in the same vein as Hourglass Factory and Amber Shadows, but it does have the same kind of hallmarks of being a little bit larger than life and containing a murder. So there's that, and I would really, really like to keep both names going and to write both, because I just think it just gives me freedom to explore two completely different technical sides of writing and crafts, I think, but also like really different ideas. I am really interested in interpersonal relationships, and I'm in the Elle Connel books, then I'm particularly interested in exploring kind of, I suppose, what you call like microaggressions and behaviors that kind of start on a sliding scale of like sociable, that descend into antisocial, through toxic, through criminal. And that's something that I think you can only do, or that makes sense to me in a kind of contemporary context. So that's something I want to keep doing with the Elle Connel books. And then for the Lucy Ribchester books, there's so many periods of history that I just really want to go like groveling around in and grubbing around in and finding little anecdotes. And I'm just really, really fascinated in the past and in how we kind of carry it around with us in ways that we don't even notice. Walking around Edinburgh, for example, walking up and down the Royal Mile and the Old Town, there's just so much history hidden in those walls, that's begging to get out. So yeah, I think I'd definitely like to, if the opportunities are there, I'd like to keep both going.
Excellent.
Nice. And you also do you mentioned it earlier, some side hustling. You're a tutor for English, you freelance journalist, stuff's been in the Guardian, the Times, do some dance writing, mentoring service. I mean, how do you find the time for all this stuff?
Well, it's not all happening at once. You go through sort of deathly quiet periods like any freelancer, and then it all comes at once and hits you between the eyes. So for most of the festival and even the month before the festival these days, then I'll be writing pretty much exclusively for the list, doing interviews, features, previews, then going out, just riding around Edinburgh on my bike, seeing as much theatre and dance as I can. And then September time comes, you have a little bit of a slump, and then other stuff pops up. So last year I found myself mentoring a writer on a fantasy YA novel. That was a really rewarding experience. I teach workshops when I can. It's just a bit of a juggling act, but I think, you know, having good diary skills, so just trying to keep it like a rigorous diary kind of helps. And I love it. You know, it keeps, I think the chopping and changing kind of keeps, for me anyway, like it keeps my brain active, and keeps me, it just kind of keeps me feeling sort of alive and stimulated. I never get bored doing any one aspect of my work because it chops and changes. And I used to think that like the absolute dream would be to only write fiction and to only be able to write fiction. And in the second year of my book deal with Hourglass Factory, when I was writing Amber Shadows, that was pretty much what I was doing. And I was actually really miserable. You know, I felt really sort of just tied to fiction and kind of bored and not incentivized to kind of seek work elsewhere. And actually the balance is something that makes me really happy. You know, as a writer, I think you've got to get out there and like live and learn things. I'm just taking on a project just now that's going to enable me to do quite a lot of research into art history. And, you know, like with my work with the National Trust for Scotland, ideas come from that, you know. I did some work with Edinburgh University's informatics department a couple of years ago, freelance work. And it was just mind-blowing, like the amount that I learned about the tech industry, and it's given me ideas for like at least 2 novels that I want to develop, you know. So I think it's just such a fundamental part of my work. I don't think I'd ever want to give any of it up.
Excellent. Nice. And so you've got the Lucy Ribchester book out on submission just now. You've just binned an Elle Connel book. What is in the pipeline? Are you going to start another Elle Connel book?
I have just started another Elle Connel, yes, which is where that notebook's going to come really, really handy.
Good plug.
So I binned the Elle Connel book because I had a more streamlined idea that's kind of thematically overlapping with You Can Say. One of the things I wanted to explore in You Can Say, so I mean, as you'll know yourself, like from writing, there's so many ideas that kind of come together like little sort of pockets of meteorites and just blast together into what forms the idea. So it wasn't just Stephen King and Misery, it wasn't just the SAS thing. There was also this idea of like the different ways in which men have freedom or have complacency towards freedom in the contemporary world as opposed to women. So for example, I could never imagine a woman knocking on a strange man's door and saying, can I come into your house, especially if he was a little bit strange. But you know, the idea that a man can do that because a woman is not threatening, she's not frightening, there is that idea that like there's maybe more freedom involved for men in that respect. And I want to kind of continue this theme but slightly look at it from a slightly different slant, you know, the idea of the different freedoms that men and women have in social settings because of this kind of this fear of violence that hangs over the head of women.
Cool. Excellent. That sounds very exciting. I like the sound of that a lot.
Thanks.
What was the last book that you read?
The last book I read was Dorothy Coomson's My Other Husband, and it is absolutely brilliant. I am actually really angry and ashamed that it's the first of Dorothy Coomson's 18 novels that I've read. And it was just, I mean, it's a psychological thriller, but it is so psychologically like scalpel accurate in terms of behavior, microaggressions, the way she gets under the skin of abusive relationships and how insidious that kind of behavior can be as well. It deals with racism in the workplace. It's just a really, really in-depth, thoroughly rich and brilliant book. Nice. Yeah, so she was such a wonderful author to have discovered, and now I've got a big back catalogue to go back to.
And what about the last film that you watched?
The last film? What was the last film I watched? Oh, that is a good question. You know, I've been watching so much Drag Race and Strictly. I haven't watched a film in ages. I started watching Dahmer last night. I've been reading all the sort
Netflix
of
one,
controversial articles about it, and I'm kind of curious about it. What was the last film I watched? I'm sure I watched a film recently. That's going to really
It's
annoy me.
awful. It's going to question
I
your
know
mind
what
goes
I mean.
blank and you suddenly can't think of any film you've ever watched in your entire life.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. No, I did watch something I'm sure I watched a film during the festival. I went to the cinema as well, like not that long ago. Sorry, my mind is
Obviously,
It's
whatever it was obviously
It
great.
was
It was
dreadful,
obviously amazing. That's such an impression. No, but I want to watch Flux Gourmet, the new Peter Strickland film. I love
Oh, yeah,
Peter
yeah.
Strickland, and one of my favorite films is The Duke of Burgundy. I just think it's amazing and so beautiful and surreal and psychologically nuanced and twisted. And yeah, so I'm really excited to see Flux Gourmet.
Cool.
Nice.
And well, you mentioned you were watching Dahmer, but what was the last TV show that you've sort of finished, a series or something like that?
We watched the series of the second series of The Capture. I think that's a really
Brilliant.
interesting
Oh,
show.
yeah.
And when I watched the first series, I was actually working in Edinburgh University's informatics, and I was working with somebody whose research focused on AI and kind of neural learning, like artificial intelligence learning, machine learning AI, and I asked him, so how realistic is this show? Come on. And he was like, very. And I was like, oh,
Unfortunately.
that's quite sobering. So yeah, I find that very interesting, very twisty, and and very with a lot of kind of food for thought.
Excellent.
Nice. And the very, very last thing we do is a super quick fire either or, and I will say there's no right answer here apart from one, but we'll start off with historical crime or modern day crime.
Oh God, both.
Sitting on the fence
You
there.
had to pick
Yeah.
one.
Oh, if I had to pick one, historical, because modern day will turn into historical one of these days.
Unbelievable. Just threw Ellie under the bus there.
TV or cinema?
Cinema, always.
Night owl or early bird?
Early bird, I think.
Music or no music when you're writing?
No music.
And
Yeah.
last one, real book or ebook?
Oh, are you even asking me this? Real book, real.
Oh, I know. Historical
Keep it
author.
in
There's
the
no
back.
way ebook was going to
No,
win.
I can't even. Oh, I don't have a Kindle. I don't. I borrowed one from my mum when the kids were born because I was like, well, it'll probably be easier, especially if I'm doing night feeds and I want to read. But I just can't do it. I can't do it. I love the smell of a book, even if it's a
Some
new
of these
book, an old book.
weirdos that have these smell.
Tarek is very
Understands people
pro
that-
ebook. these
Oh,
days.
really?
Yeah,
Well, very, very few people are, so I feel I have to
know.
Standing up.
give them a
Exactly.
voice. Exactly. Yeah. So I think
I mean,
I'm
I
gonna go
agree
five
on
people.
the real book front. So yeah, and the smell of a new book is great.
Yeah,
I
but
love it.
you're both very odd people. Smelling your books.
Well, thanks very much to Lucy for that episode. I thought that was really interesting, and
Yeah, it was great.
a very brave move that she had at the start of
I know.
her
wasn't it?
novel writing career to change from, in quotes, a big agent to a smaller agent because she felt that that's what the book needed. That's admirable. It was the right decision given her success, but also quite a scary decision to make it at that
as
stage.
we've chatted to a few folk who've done that in the past, and I think they would all say that you have to do what's right for you and your book and your career, but it's still such a long process trying to find an agent. When you find one, you almost feel like you don't want to let go, no matter even if that's actually harming your career. So
Yeah.
it's quite a tough one, isn't it?
Yeah, no, definitely. But yeah, as it has been proven by not just by Lucy, but as you say, by some of our other guests, it can be the right thing. So I suppose it's a question of sort of trusting your instinct on that, and taking that step can help further your career. So yeah, thanks to Lucy for coming on. Obviously, the latest Elle Connel book is out now, and we'll put links to her books both as Lucy and Elle in the podcast description. But next week we're staying in the world of crime, but traveling across the world.
Yeah, we're going down under in a very exciting episode. We're chatting with Jane Harper. I'm a pretty huge fan of. The Dry, of course, was her debut novel, which was made into the film with Eric Bana.
Which is a great film. I've not read
it's
the
good,
book,
very
but,
good, yeah. And her latest novel is Exiles, which is out in the UK at least very, very shortly, next week, in fact. And that's the final novel with Aaron Falk, her kind of investigative protagonist from The Dry.
Yeah, and we chat to her about that, why, not many authors would sort of say, this is my last novel with this character, when it's been successful. And we chat to her about why she wanted to do that. And yeah, just a really interesting story. We've spoken now to a few Australian authors, and the Australian literary scene is obviously quite different from the UK one, but is definitely a fast growing scene, and in no small part thanks to Jane. I think it was Chris Hammer who we had on, who's now obviously a big success as well, but he said that Jane's success was one of the reasons that people started paying attention to Australian fiction.
Yeah, she's a fantastic author, and it's a really fun interview. I think there'll be a lot of good stuff in there for everyone to listen to. Yeah,
definitely. So, if you enjoyed this episode, please do take the time to rate and reviews on your favourite podcast app. That really helps us to continue to get great guests on the podcast.
And of course, if anybody wants to get in touch, they can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, or they can send us an email to podcast@rightgear.co.uk. And there's also some kind of master.
I was going to say, do you want to have a go at that, Tarek?
I wouldn't even know where to begin, to be honest, Marco.
So we're at Page One Pod on writing.exchange. You can find us there. It's not difficult.
I know, it actually sounds simpler every time you say it, and I feel by the time we get to episode 200, I might have it locked in my head a little bit.
Excellent.
I struggle with the bloody email address.
You do. It does. The number of times we have to re-record the email address is embarrassing, frankly. But yeah, have a great week, and we'll see you next episode.
See you later.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, please leave a comment down below, hit that thumbs up button, and be sure to hit that subscribe button as well, so you never miss an episode like these ones below.
And if you want to get in touch, you can always drop us a tweet in the Twitter machine, which is at UKPage1, as evidenced here, and our other social media channels are available.
Otherwise, we hope to see you next episode.
See you later.